Now we turn to climate change. UK scientists are saying the bushfires in Australia are a warning of what may be to come around the world. This is in a report from the UK's Met Office. These scientists warn that if the planet increases by 3 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels by the end of this century, there could be fires of the kind we're seeing in Australia in many other places. BBC Science editor David Shookman's been looking at this.
Day after day, fire crews brave the front lines in a crisis that's still escalating. Many of the blazes are out of control and beyond anyone's experience.
It's the worst I've seen in 21 years. This is honestly the worst I've seen, the most I've actually been out. Makes it very hard, especially when you've got family and commitments and all the rest of it.
In a town in Victoria, a ghostly scene. Cars burnt and grey with ash. Fires are a natural feature of Australia, but record heat has made them more severe than usual, something that had been predicted.
Climate scientists knew this was going to happen at some point, whether it was now or 10 years from now. We were going to get this perfect storm, and it was going to be pretty horrible. We dodged a bullet a couple of years ago when we had a hot summer then, but it was eventually going to transpire.
And this seems to be part of a pattern. A new study of wildfires around the world, from the Amazon rainforest to California, says human activity is raising temperatures and adding to the threat, including in Europe and many other regions. This was Spain last year. The scientists involved in the research say the key now is to cut emissions of the gases that are heating the planet.
In terms of the urgency, it's getting worse all the time. So the sooner we can rein in emissions, the sooner we can slow the increase in warming and increase climate change impacts.
And I've been talking to David.
Climate science, like many branches of science, advances in relatively small steps, and often you may feel you've heard this before, but there are little nuances and changes. So what they've done with this study is review all recent research into wildfires. And actually they've concluded, or one conclusion is that overall the global total of wildfires has actually reduced in area over recent decades. Bit of a surprise, I can see it in your face there.
Tell me why.
One reason, probably the main reason, is that more and more natural grassland, natural forest has been hacked away and converted into farmland. So that when you there's less area for there to be a wildfire on, if you like. So in a sense, it's quite a mechanical reason for that. But they've also found that as the temperature of the planet has warmed, and this is the bit that won't surprise you, you get more combustible conditions, assuming there's vegetation to burn, assuming other situations are as they would be to encourage a fire to start. If it's hotter and if it's drier, which you're going to get with global warming, then a fire becomes more likely.
I was talking to someone.
You're still not
No,
surprised.
I'm processing it all.
Yeah.
No, I'm interested. And I was speaking to a colleague from the BBC Audiences team last week, and they were saying the amount of interest in Australia is extraordinary, exceeding almost any other story in the world at the moment. I'm wondering if people in the climate science world have noticed that the world is perhaps tuning in a way that it hasn't always done previously.
I think they are. I mean, there you have a Western advanced democracy apparently living in quite fragile conditions. I mean, if you think about much of the Australian dream is to live in a suburban house, perhaps in woodland, you know, on the edge of a city, in stunning scenery. Well, suddenly you start to see the dark side of that, the flip side of that. And I think what this new study does, and actually a lot of this recent research, emphasizes the absolute critical importance of preparing as well you can for the kinds of conditions that are going to become more likely in future. In other words, more emphasis, if you can, on creating fire breaks. Now, there's a long, difficult backstory there in Australia, but the more that can be done, the more citizens can be prepared to evacuate. All of those kinds of things, roads can be cleared, will adapt the population to what could be a new situation. But the climate scientists are very clear that they've looked at wildfires around the world. Each situation is slightly different, but one thread unites them all, which is hotter, drier conditions, I'm saying it again, make fires more likely.
Well, more than 100 fires are still burning across Australia. This is what some of them look like from up above. This is the state of New South Wales, and you can see the volume of smoke. Now, we've talked many times about how that smoke is affecting life in cities like Sydney and Canberra, but it's affecting Melbourne too as well. Have a look at some of these pictures. This is the city blanketed in smoke. The air quality has been described as hazardous. We know lots of people have been choosing to wear face masks, as you can see in this footage. The smoke's also disrupted the qualifying stages of the Melbourne Open, the Australian Open tennis tournament. One player collapsed and complained of breathing difficulties, and as you can see, she had to be helped off court. The smoke also isn't just affecting Australia. We know it's reached South America last week, and this graphic from NASA, using NASA data, shows that in fact the smoke is completing a full circuit of the globe. Now, the Australian media is an important part of the bushfire story. Rupert Murdoch's News Corp dominates the media landscape in Australia. It publishes more than 140 newspapers, employs around 3,000 journalists across print, broadcast and online. And critics say Mr Murdoch's newspapers and TV networks have continued to publish stories and opinion pieces that dismiss widely accepted science about climate change, which makes this story in the Daily Beast worthy of note. Rupert Murdoch's son, James Murdoch, sits on the News Corp board. A spokesperson for him and his wife, Catherine, say their views on climate are well established and their frustration with some of News Corp and Fox coverage of the topic is also well known. They are particularly disappointed with the ongoing denial among the news outlets in Australia, given obvious evidence to the contrary. So strong stuff, and there are different examples that we could highlight. Sometimes it's simply an issue of emphasis. Here we have the front page of the Australian newspaper owned by Rupert Murdoch on the day that Australia hit its highest ever average temperature. The choice of lead story? Well, they chose to go with a story about coal exports. Other times things are more explicit. We know that across the last 100 years, Australia's climate has been getting warmer and warmer, particularly in the last 25. This is data from the Bureau of Meteorology there. And meteorologists are telling us that hotter, drier climate increases the risk of bushfire seasons being longer and more intense. And you'll find examples of the Murdoch media questioning that. So here is a quote from one columnist, News Corp columnist Chris Kenny, writing in the Australian newspaper, "Hysterical efforts to blame the fires on climate change continue, even though we've always faced this threat and always will." And here's another News Corp columnist, Andrew Bolt, speaking on his programme on the Murdoch-owned Sky News Australia.
The global warming hysteria right now is insane. Once again, I heard not a single voice of doubt on a national broadcaster this morning that actually this drought, no, it's not caused by global warming, nor are the bushfires, nor will it help at all with bushfires to cut our emissions. Instead, we had politicians who should know better. They're out there, they're feeding the fear and the misinformation.
Well, the Australian newspapers pushed back at its critics. It tweeted an editorial over the weekend saying, "Our factual account of bushfires, climate change and the remedies, as well as our editorial commentary on these issues, have been willfully and ineptly misinterpreted as climate denial." And that language is familiar. Go back to 2015. Here's a tweet by Rupert Murdoch, who owns The Australian, saying, "A climate change sceptic, not a denier." And he also goes on to talk about alarmist nonsense. Now, describe all this however you choose. What we can be certain of is that, one, commentators seeking to distance the fires and climate change are being given space in the Australian media owned by Rupert Murdoch, and climate scientists are clear in saying the broader pattern of climate change and the weather it brings does increase the risk of extreme fires. Now, the important thing to note here is that whatever conclusions are drawn about the bushfires have political consequences in Australia, not least for its enormous coal industry. The Prime Minister turned to this when speaking to ABC News at the weekend.
We are going to continue to evolve our policy in this area to reduce emissions even further, and we're going to do it without a carbon tax, without putting up electricity
so if you can do it
prices,
without a carbon tax and putting up prices,
and without shutting down traditional industries upon which regional Australians depend for their very livelihood.
They do.
That's what I took to the
But are you willing
Australian
to
people.
use this?
But this matter may, in the end, be taken out of the hands of politicians and the fossil fuel industry. Have a look at this. BlackRock is the world's largest fund manager. It's dumping, and has announced today it's dumping more than $500 million in thermal coal shares. This is part of a more active stance on climate change, it says. In a letter sent to a range of chief executives of the world's largest companies, BlackRock's founder says climate change has become a defining factor in companies' long-term prospects. He goes on, we do not believe that the long-term economic or investment rationale justifies continued investment in this sector. That may be, but for the moment, the coal industry maintains the support of Scott Morrison and his government and the passionate support of some high-profile Australian commentators on Rupert Murdoch's wage bill.